Like Henry VIII, it might appear that money was simply no object. But some of the most extravagant royals in history have found their bank balances and their reputations in serious danger. Perhaps none so much as George IV. What many people probably know about George IV comes from Hugh Laurie's depiction of him as the dim and self-absorbed Prince Regent in Blackadder, barely tolerated by his manservant. Unfortunately for George, the lack of respect that his butler has for him there was pretty much what most of his subjects felt about him in real life. George was one of the least popular royals in the whole of British history. In his youth, as the Prince of Wales, he was viewed as lazy and ill-suited to the hard work of state matters, preferring a debauched and very expensive lifestyle. Much to the annoyance of his father, George III, the Prince of Wales liked to spend his time with those who drank and gambled. Even in his youth, he accrued vast debts, which were caused chiefly by his absolute commitment to the finer things in life. Besides partying, George's other passions included architecture and design. When the young prince came of age in 1783, his father gave him Carlton House as his London residence, along with a huge renovation budget to keep him occupied, and perhaps to try and instill a sense of responsibility in his wayward son. Little did he know that his generosity would rather have the opposite effect on George, who wasn't one to compromise on budget when it came to his artistic vision. I've come to Brighton Pavilion, one of George's greatest surviving building projects, to meet curator Dr. Alexandra Loska, to get a taste of George's appetite for extravagance.
Wow! This is incredible. What we see here is almost a complete vision. This is George. This is his take on chinoiserie, this sort of very flamboyant, very playful style, taking inspiration from other cultures. And if you put to one side for a second how much it cost, you think, this is his personality inscribed on the walls.
The flair George manifested in his building projects was matched only by the seriously decadent parties he hosted. He didn't accede to the crown until the age of 57, leaving him with decades of time to kill and plenty of opportunities to entertain.
What the Pavilion Brighton was always about was about inviting people, wining and dining and singing and dancing. And you can really tell what is most important to George, because the two largest rooms are the banqueting room and at the other end of the building, the music room.
But unsurprisingly, places like Carlton House and Brighton Pavilion didn't come cheap. The chandelier alone in the pavilion's banqueting room cost £5,000. To put that in perspective, a maid at the time would have earned £50 a year. Perhaps the best example of George's spending habits is the pavilion's jaw-droppingly elaborate music room.
This was probably the most expensive room to furnish, to decorate, and it cost at least £45,000. It's not building it, it's just decorating it.
I mean, that would just be a mind-blowing amount to spend today on decorating a room, and this is in the 1820s. I mean, let's talk about these sums of money, because I can't quite get my head around them. So how much money was he given to live on?
Well, he was the future King of England. He would have expected to have an income from Parliament, and he wanted £100,000 a year in 1783. His father, King George III, said, I will only give you 50,000, but you'll also have the income from the Duchy of Cornwall, and you may get some extras along the line for certain projects. So an income of £50,000 a year. I don't know what that is today. Do you have any?
This is the National Archives currency converter, so we're 1780.
1783. I wouldn't say no to that today.
50,000 would be nice, wouldn't it?
But let's see.
50,000 plus the money from the Duchy of Cornwall, so
But
let's
12,000.
Okay, £62,000. A mere £62,000 in 1780 is 5.3 million. And yet, that doesn't seem to be enough.
It's not enough for him.
It's hard to live on 5.3 million.
It's not enough for him, so he runs up debts. Within 3 years, he has racked up debts of £270,000.
Oh,
this is 1786.
1786. Computer says, let's see, £270,000. That's £23 million.
Yeah, and this is
£23 million.
And this is before he starts building the Royal Pavilion. So this is what he's doing in London and all his other hobbies.
For the Playboy prince to be spending such vast sums on such an excessive lifestyle caused more than a few raised eyebrows among the paying public.
Where is this money coming from? I mean, this isn't his money, is it? This belongs to the nation.
It is Parliament subsidising or, financing the royal family, the monarchy. And he is in constant of discussions or arguments with Parliament and the King.
These arguments happening in the late 18th and early 19th centuries about how much Prince George deserved get to the very nub of what feels like a very modern issue. To what extent should the public be funding the lifestyles of the royal family?
Some people thought that the Prince of Wales was a private citizen and therefore his father should deal with him. Others argued that it was the obligation of the taxpayer to almost invest in him for his future because he was going to be king. So they weren't very clear what the distinction was between private and royal, private and public. And that problem continues on really to this day. When Windsor Castle went on fire, the public were presented with the bill. And there was a debate about why that was. More recently, Frogmore Cottage renovations for Meghan and Harry. The public paid for that. But then when they left royal service, they had to repay that sum of money. It's a question of why are we paying for these things? We don't get access to them. And that, again, is part of this complicated mess of working out what is royal and what is not royal.
While today's royals might be rather more discreet about their spending, Prince George clearly saw it as his right. By 1795, he'd racked up an astronomical £650,000 of debt, roughly 78 million in today's terms. He was mobbed by creditors in the street and reluctantly forced to marry his German cousin, Princess Caroline, to clear his debts. But George wasn't about to change his ways. He continued his spending spree for years, even after he finally became king in 1820, constantly extending and redecorating the building at Brighton, creating the extraordinary pavilion we know today.
This is the saloon. It's one of the most formal rooms.
That is rather wonderful, that silk, isn't it?
It's red and gold, and then in combination with silver. It's really unusual. It's bling.
It certainly is.
Bling, and it is really experimental bling, because if you create a silvered wall decoration, wallpaper, of course it will tarnish, and it did. So after a few years, all that silver went black.
Oh.
But George didn't care, because he would just replace it, or he would have come up with new schemes, with new ideas.
If this shows us George over 50 years, then he's spending through that entire period of time. There's no point at which he thinks, OK, enough is enough. Everything's great, I'll stop spending now. He just carries on. Think of the French Revolution. You've got people being beheaded for exactly this sort of excess just across the channel.
You're absolutely right, and I think maybe that's one of the reasons why he did it. Why not do it now? Why not enjoy life now? Because I don't know, I might lose my head too to the guillotine.
But while George was enjoying life in the outrageously opulent pavilion, what did the public think of his projects? Alexandra and I have access to Brighton Pavilion's archive rooms to find out what George's subjects thought of his excesses.
So, This is behind the scenes.
We are very much behind the scenes. We are in what was originally George's private bathroom.
Oh, fabulous.
And where we're standing now was basically a small swimming pool, a 10-foot deep plunge pool.
The man knew how to live. Okay, and what are these? These are amazing cartoons.
Well, George had the great misfortune, or perhaps fortune, to live in the great age of political caricatures. So we have these incredibly funny, daring comments on political life, on society. And of course, George was fodder for the cartoonists, for the caricaturists of the time.
These are just fabulous because they just give us such insight into how people wanted to skewer him at the time. I mean, this one, we've got to talk about this one.
Yes.
This is fabulous.
It's George at the end of his life, really. He's by then, you know, obese and he has various health issues. He sits on a teapot dressed like a Chinese mandarin. And that's, of course, a reference to where we are here in the Brighton Pavilion. Yeah. Behind him, you can see the Royal Pavilion. So, what's the teapot all about? Well, this is the Treasury teapot. This is where the money is coming from. And he's quite literally sitting on it and it's spurting money. And what's he spending the money on? Well, the Royal Pavilion. Changes to Buckingham Palace. Also a giraffe. And the cartoonists call this his playthings. So he is a man who should be ruling the country and looking after his people. Instead, he's playing with a giraffe. And the giraffe, by the way, was a real giraffe. He kept this at Windsor Great Park.
It's just such an evocative image. In fact, he reminds me of the figure from Alice in Wonderland who sits and smokes his hookah pipe.
Quite.
But this is contemporary comment on it, and it's saying, look, he's not doing what he's supposed to do. He's just building and creating and designing, and he's having fun, but doesn't he have a job?
Exactly.
These cartoons vividly depict how George's indulgent and ostentatious lifestyle became the subject of public ridicule. By the end of his life, he grew morbidly obese, and suffering from severe gout, he never salvaged his wretched reputation.
When George died as King George IV in 1830, few of his subjects mourned his loss. There remains nothing to be said or done about George IV, wrote the Times, except pay, as pay we must for his profusion.
Next, the medieval mistress who went from